I guess it goes to show, no matter how fortified you think you are, never expose your back door. Hitler sleeping in on D-Day. June 6, 1944 signifies a massive win for the Allied powers in World War II. American, Canadian, and British forces were able to storm the beaches of Nazi-occupied Normandy in France, giving them the leverage to truly sink their teeth into the Axis powers, allowing them to ultimately win the war. And while we're all grateful that things worked out this way, why did it work out this way? At the time, there was a very real and dystopian possibility that the Nazis could have won D-Day and history would have looked a lot different. But that's a bit off topic. The biggest contributors to the Allied powers' success on D-Day comes down to two major points. One being the Allied powers' general clever strategy, and the second being a general lack of planning and communication in preparation for this attack. And when I say in preparation, I mean the Germans knew that the coast of France was susceptible to an attack, and they were at this point expecting it. But the only problem was they didn't know where the Allied forces would attack, and this was a major problem internally. Hitler and other high-ranking officials believed that Pas de Calais is undoubtedly where the Allied powers would try to land. However, other officials believed that Normandy was also a possibility. There was no general consensus on where they could have landed, and Hitler's solution was to spread out troops all across France's shoreline. And while this seems logical, it had a major flaw. No one individual location was extremely well equipped, and when the invasion did happen, it would take some time for a counterattack from the Germans to gather all of the other troops from the shoreline to the one area where the actual battle was happening. This mismanagement alone could be considered its own historical mistake, but it doesn't end there. Due to some previous red herrings that the Allied powers threw, specifically staging a false invasion on Pas de Calais, when the actual attack on D-Day happened, German troops weren't sure if this was a real invasion or simply another distraction, which leads us to the situation I mentioned earlier. On the morning of D-Day, when the attacks started happening, Hitler was fast asleep. It's reported that he was up late the night before watching newsreels and fell asleep around 3 a.m. Now, interestingly, because the high-ranking officials did not believe that the attack on Normandy was not the major attack that they saw coming, they decided that it was not worth waking up Hitler, and they decided they would allow him to wake up and then they would figure out what to do next. However, that window from the storming of Normandy to when Hitler woke up and began to make counterattack plans, significant progress was already made by the Allied powers, leaving Germany in a really bad spot. Now, this doesn't mean that the Allied powers had no resistance. The Allied powers had to fight against extreme resistance and saw countless tragedies during this battle, with one of the biggest reasons being the Germans fought like hell because it was very well known among the high-ranking Nazi officials that if the Allied powers were able to successfully storm the beaches, they would have at that point won the war. So even though the Germans were unprepared for this battle, they still fought as hard as they could because they knew that this battle would likely be one of the last, which wasn't far from the truth. Hitler spread his troops way too thin, tried to keep too tight of a grip on the entire operation. His high-ranking officials didn't take the attack on Normandy seriously and didn't wake him up, and for that reason, Hitler slept in until 10 a.m., 3.5 hours after the massive naval and aerial bombardment started to take place on French soil. And I think it's important to note that while this was a mistake on Hitler's part, this mistake gave the Allied powers a lot of leverage, and the impact this had on history was net positive, so sometimes mistakes can be good, if they're made by bad people. This video in total could have been 10 hours long with all of the insane historical mistakes